Hi, my name is Eve Tuck, and I am one of the co-conveners of the William T. Grant Foundation Writing Fellows Initiative, and I am here with my co-convener, Kay Wayne Yang.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wayne Yang, and yes, one of the co-conveners, and we're here with one of three of our amazing contributors to this edited volume, which is going to have such a huge impact. And that's why we're doing this webinar, is to honor the fact that both their work, but also the people viewing this, that this might be helpful for you. And so we're hoping this format is accessible, fun, casual, but informative.
Yeah. So as a whole, this initiative has invited all of us to deepen our theorizing of racism and racial stratification, and to become more precise in our discussions of racism in our research, to be more accountable to the experiences of research participants and collaborators. At the same time, we have tried to build collective knowledge about the kinds of discourses of Blackness and Indigeneity and racialization that are needed in social science research to reduce inequalities in the lives of young people. So our call for participants in this initiative was really deliberate in emphasizing a storytelling approach. And the authors that we have gathered here together are really wonderful examples of that storytelling approach. We hope that this approach is both pedagogically and personally meaningful to those of you who are watching this webinar, those of you who pick up the volume. But we don't ever want for anybody to feel like they need to be near the end of their learning story in order to have been part of this project. In many ways, we are just at the beginning of our story of learning to do research about racism and racial stratification differently than we were trained to do in our graduate programs.
Yes, and one of the key features of this, what Eve just said about we're not at the end of our stories in terms of theory, is I think you're going to hear in these authors' discussions about what they wrote, is that they are addressing theories of racialization, of Blackness, indigeneity, and racialization. And particularly by addressing, we mean these theories that we often deploy in our research, that we have been trained in. Authors are going to reflect upon and think about how unaddressed racial hierarchies need to be questioned, that are often built into the very theories that we've been trained in. And then you'll hear authors forwarding theorizations about indigeneity, Blackness, and racialization, but also theorizations about theorizations in some respect, to really point out the serious implications that theories of how we theorize Blackness, indigeneity, and racialization impacts the research we do, and therefore impacts racialized young people.
Mm-hmm. The title of this section, this gathering of authors and scholars, is Refusing to Speak Against Ourselves and Our Communities. And this, in so many ways, we feel so fortunate to be the people who edited this section, because this idea of refusing to speak against ourselves, against our communities, has been a through line in our works, in our individual works, in our collaborative works, and in many of our other collaborations. And I think in so many ways is a central imperative, a guiding framework of all of our research and scholarly activities. So this section together tells a story of how the wonderful authors here refuse the damage-centered logics and assumptions that undergird their disciplines, and how these damage-centered logics dehumanize both them and their communities. And so in each of these chapters, the authors have described their break away from the traditions of social science that in their fields continue in some ways to produce harmful stories about Black young people and Black families. and erase what Black people already know.
And so without further ado, we're going to pass it off to our first author and speaker this morning, Victoria Copeland.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Again, my name is Victoria. I'm currently a senior policy analyst, but I did receive my PhD and my MSW from UCLA. And I wrote this chapter. I'm just going to read a few notes about my reflection on writing this chapter. And so I wrote this chapter as I was experiencing a range of emotions, and I was truthfully having a lot of writer's block because of it. And usually in academia, we're taught to push these feelings away and focus on producing for production's sake. But in that moment, I decided to instead lean into these feelings of sadness and frustration. And I ended up writing a dedication to my grandma, which I will be reading today. That's at the beginning of my chapter. And through the rest of the chapter, I grappled with the complexities of bringing my own stories and experiences into my research and into my theorizations. In this chapter, I was inspired deeply by Catherine McKittrick, who asked us to think through how we know and where we know from. And because of this, I decided to really interrogate the basis of social work, my own department, and the profession's ethical commitments, and juxtapose it with the ethics and geographies of Black social workers and the Black mothers that I was working with at the time for my dissertation and in my organizing. And through this juxtaposition, I outline how we can understand that theory is not reserved for those who maintain a specific positionality within the academic hierarchy, which is commonly but insidiously taught to many students. And I really started to grapple with what it means to understand Black people's experiences, like my own experiences, and the oppositional geographies, our oppositional geographies as a site of construction, creation, and resistance. And so that is my reflection on this chapter. The section that I'm going to read today is just the abstract, which is going to be available online, but I think is a great summary of what the chapter is. And then I'm going to read my dedication, which was really powerful and really dictated sort of the tone of my entire chapter. And forgot to say that I am a Black and Filipino woman. I'm wearing a gray top, collar top, some black and white earrings, and I have glasses on. So the abstract of my chapter: mythology, folklore, anecdote. These labels are frequently placed on stories shared by those who occupy unimaginable and uninhabitable terrain, end quote. Yet those who occupy these grounds know intimately that these spaces are sites of truth and evidence, spaces that deeply inform movements towards a liberatory future. Understanding these, quote, demonic grounds, quote, end quote, as referred to by Catherine McKittrick, as essential to ethics, theory, and research, provides us a different gaze upon which the field of social work and its ethical commitments can be analyzed. As such, this chapter begins to challenge this pseudo-binary between storytelling and rigorous theorization by deeply interrogating the dominant ethical commitments of the social work profession. These hegemonic ways of knowing proliferate most social work spaces and have often reified a social ordering that has maintained the infliction of violence onto Black communities. Consequently, the contributions and theorizations of Black people have been ignored and deprioritized within the academy. Nevertheless, Black people continue to use oppositional geographies to chart new pathways and create ways of knowing through relationality and collective shared experiences. These geographies challenge the status quo of social work and its accompanying practices, calling attention to the implications of rendering one's experience as invisible or insignificant. And so my chapter, Black Geographies and Social Work, begins. Bari-bari saan ka agunged bari, sapumukan kami iti pabakira para kami. I begin this journey with you from my kitchen in DC. It's 11:30 p.m. My grandma is in the hospital with congestive heart failure, and I am thousands of miles away, unable to sit and properly form the words needed for this chapter. The quote above is a chant, or prayer rather, that keeps replaying in my head. It's a rendition of one that my grandma has recited since I was a child, the one she learned from her mother-in-law. My grandma is from Pangasinan in the Philippines, and my late grandpa is from Ilocos Sur. To them, the bari-bari is more than just a simple ritual or chant. It's what bolsters physical and spiritual well-being. The buri is recited when one is ill with anything, from a slight sniffle to full-blown tumors. It's also recited when we depart from our elders. Whenever I am sick or if I'm simply saying goodbye, I would kneel and place my head between my grandma's hands. As she rubbed my forehead, my chest, my stomach, and the tips of my shoulders, she would recite something akin to buri tapumukan kami, Daddy, referring to my grandpa. Please watch over your granddaughter, help her finish school, and keep her safe and well. As explained by my grandma, the bari is a way to acknowledge the presence of our ancestors, whether they are currently present or will be visiting us in the future. She says, quote, their spirit might be with us and want to just talk to you. That's why you feel sick, end quote. Where my grandparents are from, they believe that ancestors' visits can cause physical illness. There is no malintent to this illness. It is simply a consequence of the tensions within the dimensions. It's your ancestors' way of telling you hello and that they are watching over you. By reciting the buri, we acknowledge our elders, pay them respects, and ask them for protection and safety. Based on scant scholarship, I found that Western researchers classify the buri as, quote, mythology. However, for many indigenous Filipino people, it has been referred to as sacred practice offered to us by our Ilocano ancestors. According to Filipino researchers, artists, and writers, the buri was once considered a chant that inhabitants of the Locos would say before cutting down the trees in the mountains. The translation of buri is, do not feel bad, my friend, for we cut as we are ordered. The people of the Locos would recite this to the Mangmangkik, which are nitos or secondary gods, or spirits that are found in the environment, so that they would not be offended when the trees were cut down. If the nitos were offended, they could inflict illness on the human. Now, although that tradition of the buri may have shifted in its purpose over generations, it is far from being a mythical practice. The ritual continues to remind us that we are all connected to the land, to the ones before us, and to each other. It reminds us that knowledge is created by sharing stories with each other and passing down lessons to generations that come after us. I started with this reflection on the buri to not only honor my grandmother, but to ground this chapter in what it means to challenge the ways in which we come to know, where we know from, and how we continue to learn, which is, again, quoting from Catherine McKittrick. Our stories are beyond what some might consider mythology. They are intertwined with our physical realities, our material conditions, and the ways we both view and exist in the world. Thus, theory is not inextricably tied to Western science, nor does it exist solely in the imagination of our captors, the ones who try to entrap us and force us into categories of the unknown or the abnormal. Just as the buri blends the lines between our dimension, the afterlife, and the liminal space between, approaching research and theory with relationality in mind holds space for and encourages complexity. It establishes new ways of learning together through recollecting memories and sharing lessons. It reconceptualizes forms of care and protection that are rooted in community and encourages presence and vulnerability. Theory and research start with who we are and what we are aiming to offer the world and each other. And that is the beginning of my chapter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And one thing that I've learned so much from in your chapter is through the way that you connect this this story and this discussion of the bari with the kinds of theories of care and protection that you would like to see in your field. And so thank you so much for getting us started in that way. We're going to turn now to Derek Houston.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Derek Houston. I'm an associate professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And to, I guess, describe who I am, I say that I'm centered at the nexus of critical theory and quantitative methods. My work engages with policy questions relative to inequality and inequity across the P20 educational pipeline, advocating for a socially liberating future. My most recent scholarship takes a critical approach to understanding special education and education degree production. And additionally, as what this chapter is speaking to, I focus on critically engaging the tools and processes of quantitative research. In order to ground my work and who I am, I write this statement at the beginning of the chapter. I'm a Black man, a father and a partner, the son of 2 working-class Black parents, brother of 2 Black siblings, the biological progeny of mixed-race relations, and a 4th-generation college graduate. I'm allowed to engage in this work because of the foundations built by my Black grandparents and continued by my parents, aunts, uncles, and community from which I come. I'm responsible to this community and those like it, and I stand on the shoulders of giants with the responsibility to lift as I climb. As a piece of this chapter, I struggled with finding 5 minutes worth to pull from. I seem to be wordy at times, but I pull a section from the middle of the chapter that was labeled as repetition and quantification. So I will read from that. And a lot of the work that I write with is writing through the Black radical tradition, particularly with Fred Moten's work, Robin D.G. Kelly's work, and Chukwuemeka Zuberi's work. So here we go. Moten in 2003 asks us to think the relation of convention, in this case of quantitative methods training, to repetition. Think the way convention's dependence upon repetition is the condition of its insecurity. So that if we imagine a space between repetition, then we imagine something impossible to locate. The moment between moments presents massive ontological problems, cites Moten. I want to sit with Moten to think about the break. The moment between moments, the space between repetitions, the break offers possibility of what could be, that which challenges and disrupts the norms of convention. In this case, thinking and operating in the break interrupts convention such that what is does not necessarily have to be. What has not can be, and what remains unimagined is no longer a dream. For the convention of quantitative methods training, if what is taught continues to be taught, it could be assumed to be right in the conventional norm, creating a pedagogical power paradigm that is unlikely to be challenged. In short, repetition happens without disruption and maintains convention. Convention in this case are the general forms of quantitative methods training typically found in the graduate classrooms of the academy. Quantification and quantitative methods in the social sciences are, at their foundation, grounded in a post-positivism, as previously discussed. Unchallenged assumptions about race and racialization presented within these conventions are allowed to repeat semester to semester, year to year, and from generation to generation. The repetition of not challenging the assumptions of race and racialization, among other things, within quantitative methods training can lead to acritical examinations of outcomes that point an individual's or group's race as a cause of disparities, and not the social and structural conditions of racialization and racism. I surmise that these conventions likely have been maintained because the core pedagogy, or processes of teaching and learning quantitative methods, is repetition. Repetition is found in the types of assignments used to reinforce learning and mastery, in the textbooks used from course to course across the academy, and the passing along of pedagogical methods and tools, read sharing slides, from instructor to student. A disruption of that repetition is hard, particularly when the how to disrupt is found in critical places unlikely to be occupied by quantitative scholars. There is a security in acritical quantitative methods training that reinforces the assumptions of objectivity and avoids the messiness of the subjective. I'll read that again. There is a security in acritical quantitative methods training that reinforces the assumptions of objectivity and avoids the messiness of the subjective. Maybe repetition helps to squash the imagination of burgeoning quantitative researchers. Maybe the structures and the systems that control who is heard and what is read restrict the scholarly bounds by which future quantitative scholars abide by. Maybe seeing, in general, acritical repetitions that are repetitions that lack a critique of power of quantitative scholarship reinforces the norms and provides the condition of security needed to maintain convention. And I go on a little bit more. And finally, as a pedagogical practice, to engage in the process of learning quantitative methods without examining the assumptions by which methods are built upon is repetition. The break between those repetitions is space to ask about the why of quantification in addition to the how, the space made to acknowledge the multiple whys. If introductory statistics courses are taught how our instructors were taught using the same or similar texts, it is unlikely that the students who become instructors will follow the same path. Repetition manifests itself in the unchanging approaches to uncritical approaches to the passing along of quantitative methods. Repetition exists in the unsaid and the assumed. Zuberi penned his work in 2001. The foundational work of my quantitative training began a decade later. The discussion of manipulability and causality, let alone theory, was scant, providing room for unchecked repetition by way of silence. And that is it.
Thank you, Derek. I was really excited by this chapter, and I think people who train folks in quantitative methods, but also people being trained in it, will probably feel something when they read it. I do experience, like, when you think about the repetition, like the same methods we were taught as grad students, which for me has been several decades now. I see them being taught in quantitative methods courses now, and it's really interesting to me, both how you point to repetition as the performance of rigor, and so the avoidance of the theorization of what that rigor is actually doing. It reminds me of, I think it's throughout your chapter, how repetition in sort of accounting has a very anti-Black foundation that connects to things like eugenics, or accounts of people as property is like a kind of repetition. And then I just want to say, like, the way you formulate quantification and criticalism or criticality or quant crit, and you're drawing on CRT or critical race theory, I think is really important, because I wonder how many people read critical race theory who do quantitative methods, and whether their understanding of it is just what we're seeing from bumper stickers right now from, I'm not going to mention who's attacking critical race theory, but the way you actually excavate the history of quantification and the needing to take a break from the repetition in order for us to think about what are we theorizing when we just repeat what these methods, is actually what critical race theory did. Like, critical race theory is a legal excavation of how race became encoded in law. It's not at all what people think it is, even I think often the way it's deployed now. So quant crit, I think, is one of the things you're forwarding in your chapter. I think it's an incredible contribution, and thank you so much. And so now we're going to turn to Mahasan Cheney.
Hi, everyone. I want to start by defining myself as a scholar as well, that I am someone who dabbles in the history of education, educational policy, and am primarily concerned with the study of school discipline and punishment. And I have approached the study of school discipline not by studying police and security, but rather thinking about how punishment exists in the very policies and frames that seek to provide opportunity. So how do we think about discipline and punishment and opportunity policies? How do we think about the ways punishment exists in framing of children as disadvantaged, at risk? How did the framing of children as that way create the discourse that then provide the rationale for policies that then create punishment moments in schools? And so this chapter has been a way for me to think a little more deeply about that, and to really integrate my own teaching practice with my research as well. I've been teaching this semester a class on anti-Blackness, and teaching that class alongside revising this chapter has been really kind of eye-opening, in the sense that I'm re-engaging theories that I have since let go of. I was an ethnic studies major in undergrad, and it was so informative to the way I thought. And then I transitioned into being an educational policy scholar, and those ideas seem kind of irrelevant, but they are so prevalent and so important. And I have been really grateful to write about the importance of those ideas here and to re-engage in those ideas, even as I'm teaching my own courses on anti-Blackness in education and education policymaking. So this essay that I wrote walks through and demonstrates these anti-Black dualism that exists between paternalism and punishment. And each of the story, I walked through 3 stories. Each of them describes how research, policies, and reforms that rely on pathological descriptions of Black children as at risk or as potential troublemakers to equalize education reproduce narratives that subject Black children to punishment. And so embracing theories, practices, and methods of refusal, fugitivity, and the wayward may offer researchers a way of escaping this dualistic confinement, of refusing traditional forms of research, of epistemic disobedience, and embracing more complex narratives of youth, and hopefully undoing some of these paternalistic framings, and thereby offering new narratives or new stories as important to undoing some of these practices that punish Black youth. So I'll start by thinking through a poem that I have since incorporated into this chapter that I think just summarizes so well the frustration, I think, of what it means to be a Black scholar doing education policy research. So in a 1968 poem, Nikki Giovanni shares her memories of growing up in a Black community. Here she weaves observations of challenges with familial understanding and happy birthdays. And though she says you're poor, it isn't poverty that concerns you. The poem is offered as a lament that Black children are too often confined into simplistic narratives of poverty and hardship. Childhood remembrances, she begins, are always a drag if you're Black. And she ends by saying, I really hope no white person ever has cause to write about me. They'll probably talk about my hard childhood and never understand that all the while I was quite happy. I begin this chapter by thinking through this, that research and teaching about racial inequality is riddled with the same lament. Like many scholars who study racial inequality in education, I have had to confront a central tension in my research and teaching of wanting to ensure Black children have the right to engaging, challenging, fun, and enriching educational experiences without relying on unending stories of Black failure as a means towards advancing educational opportunity. That is, by engaging with and speaking to existing research, we tend to rely on familiar educational frames about the persistent achievement gap, dropout rates, learning loss in urban communities, narratives that overall not only pathologize students and families, but ultimately provide the rationale for their punishment. Research and policies designed to treat the at-risk, the school dropout, and to prevent crime, teenage pregnancy, or any number of outcomes deemed troubling, not only foreclose the possibility that children may have happy and beautiful lives despite their proximity to poverty, but that these narratives tend to locate the problems and therefore craft their solutions at fixing the actions and behaviors of Black children. Framing Black education through narratives of hardships and presumptions of student wrongdoing or their potential for future wrongdoing contributes to their being continually surveilled and punished. And I want to offer fugitivity, refusals, and embrace of the wayward as a mean of escaping the dualistic reinforcement of paternalism and punishment so that researchers might reimagine new ways to write with and instead of against ourselves. So I'm going to be reading from a section, A Fugitive Story of the Wayward and Undisciplining Research on Youth. Histories and theories of anti-Blackness, refusal, and fugitivity provide the language to think across the brink, that is, to trouble Black troublemaking. They do this in part by framing paternalism and punishment as part and parcel of the same racial project. and offer that we might refuse methods that would have us categorize these treatments as different. Producing legible work in the academy for them often means that Black academics must adhere to research methods that are drafted in the service of a larger destructive force, that we must become undisciplined in a sense. For historians, undisciplining has meant attending to archival absences and using narratives to make more whole those relegated to the silences in the historical record. For ethnographers like Anne Ferguson, fugitive methods took a form as she theorized institutions instead of theorizing youth behavior. So the first part of this section looks at an ethnographic project that troubles troublemaking. By embracing fugitivity as a method and as a theoretical framework and narrative, educational researchers can challenge the discourse of reports, research, and reveal the fuller lives of youth typically forced into anti-Black representations that dominate education policy and educational research. In Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Saidiya Hartman draws on her method of critical fabulation to write what she sees as a fugitive text of 20th century wayward Black women. Her work demonstrates research refusals that limit the limit of reform and the recreation of new vocabularies. Hartman's critical fabulation extrapolates stories from archives in order to recreate narratives of the historical figures typically excluded from or pushed to the background of the historical record. Hartman demonstrates how the archival record made up of surveys, monographs of sociologists, trial transcripts, the accounts of social workers and parole officers, interviews with psychiatrists and psychologists, and even prison case files reproduce or reduce 20th century Black women to pathological descriptions as always potentially deviant or criminal. In short, again, as problem. These records limit who we can know as historical actors. Are Black girls' records kept in the archive? And how we might know them, or through the paternalistic gaze of researchers, social workers, and the state. Hartman's fugitive texts of the wayward recreate the radical imagination of Black women in the 20th century and offer new possibilities and new vocabularies that we might otherwise deem unimaginable. So I wanted to share one story from this. Hartman's depiction of Maddie Jackson, a 15-year-old newly arrived on the docks of New York City from Hampton, Virginia, is an instructive example of the ways fugitivity as a counter-narrative untangles the intertwined descriptions of wayward women as potentially delinquent and therefore criminalizable. At the beginning of the chapter, Maddie has just arrived to New York City. New York was her first adventure. By the end of the chapter, readers encountered the words Maddie wrote to her mother from the behind the walls of the New York State Reformatory for women. Maddie traverses from New York migrant, her head full of dreams, to imprisoned in a reformatory. Black life on the brink was a space created by social scientists and reformers and reinforced through the state and police. Laws like New York State Wayward Minors Act criminalized sexual delinquency and subjected girls to probation or reformatory institutions to protect them from future criminality. Hartman argues that other laws like New York State Tenement House Act did little to improve the housing of the Black poor. Its benefits were overshadowed, she argues, by the abuse and harassment that accompanied the police presence inside private homes. Maddie and the other cast of girls and women featured in Hartman's account straddle the fault lines of immorality, and this proximity marks them pitiable and potentially salvageable. These paternalistic policies, like the Wayward Girls Act, rationalize sentences of first offenders and punish them to 3-year sentences in prisons. Maddie's story and Hartman's telling of it is instructive in the ways that it reveals the messiness of a fugitive approach to research and writing. Fugitivity as counter-narrative allows for wholeness and complexity that social scientists are wont to clean up through predefined and enduring categories. Throughout the chapter, we follow Maddie through scenes that, because of their messiness and their complexity, are at times difficult to read. Maddie worked as a domestic worker because factories, shops, and offices would not hire colored girls. She visited parties with her older lover and lived out of wedlock with others, just as her mother had done. She openly disregarded the property of others, an offense that, though being her first, or perhaps more accurately her last, given her previously perceived moral failings, helped rationalize her incarceration. Hartman writes away from paternalism or deficit and instead attends to beautiful experiments of women deemed wayward. Hartman tells her story by imagining how Maddie may have described herself on her terms and thereby frees her from the paternalistic judgment of the archival record that would otherwise be left to speak for her. I'll end by thinking that attending to fugitive theory allows Black researchers to take a generative stance toward refusing the violent discourses and racialized paternalism that persists through studies, reports, and research on Black youth. A fugitive text is instructive in illustrating how writing of wholeness and complexity, scholars of race and punishment may free ourselves from the rigid confines which might force us into reproducing harmful categories we are attempting to reveal, undermine, and flee from. More specifically, this research offers insights to how Black scholars of education, Black students of Black educational failure might reveal and counter pathological narratives that are dominant within liberal approaches to education and reform. Approaching a fugitive practice in educational research means embracing wholeness, supplanting outcomes with desire, and freeing ourselves from the confines of writing against ourselves. Fugitivity requires that we counter our own fields and our own trainings, that we fill in archival absences by seeking out and offering counter narratives than those preserved in existing bodies of research and in knowing. It means that sometimes we leave space for agentic absence. Some students may not want to be studied, followed, or found. Doing so may allow us to see ourselves alongside our students in all the ways they may be beautifully wayward and as part of a longer and broader subversive tradition. Okay, I'm gonna end there.
Mahasan, thank you so much for this reading and for your work in this chapter. This is a chapter that I already have recommended to people, so I can't wait until it's published to be able to share it. I think there's two really important aspects to your pointing to fugitivity, understanding fugitivity and writing fugitive texts in order to attend to the radical imagination and wayward practices of young people who may not want to be found, may not want to be known in the ways that these educational systems insist on knowing them, insist on kind of pinning them down. And so first is the possibilities that that gives for Black researchers who are wanting to be in a different relation with the Black youth who are participants in their studies, whether those are in the archives or with young people, but also because this is actually a better research practice. It's a more sophisticated, more useful research practice than something that is completely reliant on a misinterpretation of young people's fugitive acts. And so I think it's going to be lovely for this to be in the world. And thank you to Victoria and Derek and Mahasan. Congratulations, all of you, on the publication of these chapters. We're so grateful. And I think for those of you who are watching this webinar, I hope that you're able to hear the threads of what it means to refuse to speak against ourselves, refuse to speak against the communities that matter to us, that are pulsing through these chapters. I think the phrase that you used, Mahasan, is epistemic disobedience. And so even thinking, I'd like for us in this discussion portion of the webinar, and I'll offer this question to all of you or to any of you who would like to take it up, thinking about this idea of refusing to speak against ourselves, or the epistemic disobedience that's required to do the kind of work that you want to do. When you realized that the work that you wanted to do went beyond what you were formally trained to do, what did you do, and who did you turn to, and in what ways did you turn to them? I'll open that up to anybody who wants to respond to that question.
I will say that in my graduate program, I feel that I had I don't know that I necessarily started to embrace many of these ideas, but my advisor always supported a lot of the ideas that we had, and always wanted to read things that were interesting, and wanted us to take race seriously. But I think that as I am entering my first job, it has been for me, many of the students who have pushed some of these ideas, who have been encouraging. I had one student tell me, I had a professor who was scared to say certain things, and you can always tell when they're scared. And that allowed me to be very truthful in how I'm teaching and what I already think and embrace and what I want to do. And so I feel that that one comment from a student was really insightful to me. And as I am embracing this path forward, crafting in a very interdisciplinary field, who are you as a scholar? What ideas do you embrace? Who's going to tenure you? And so some of that is like, who are the people that you want to be in conversation with? But also, how do you want to be legible to your students who are also growing, And so it's been, to me, like a slow embrace and a slow kind of onioning out, I think. And I'm looking forward to blossoming more, perhaps, and embracing more of these ideas as I move forward.
I don't know, should we add to that as well? I think that I agree, like learning from people that you're in classes with, like especially in a teaching assistant position or something like that, is like so informative. Learning with all the students is like, I think, one of the most fulfilling parts of teaching, or being able to be a teacher. I would say that in grad school, I grew up a certain way within a certain community, and everything was normal to me. I think everyone around me was living a very similar experience. And so when I went to UCLA, I was coming up against a lot of things that were bringing tensions in my own life, because I noticed that the way people, my peers, my professors, were talking about those people that was my community. Those were the communities I grew up in. And I think I always had a spirit of refusal, in terms of, if something doesn't feel right to me, if something's not sitting well with how something's being talked about, or how people are being pathologized, or how somebody is taking a certain perspective that's far removed from the actual reality of the perspective of those who are living it, it just didn't settle. It didn't sit with me right. And so I actually spent a significant portion of my first and second year in grad school feeling very uncomfortable, and not knowing what to do with that discomfort, because I would bring, like I say in my chapter, I'd bring ideas to sort of counter what was being taught. And they would say, oh, that's advocacy, that's not research. Like, oh, that's your own lived experience, but that's not really like filling a research gap, or that's not really what we pay attention to in the academy. And so instead of sort of listening to what everyone or those people were saying, even though they were the people in charge of my grades and things like that, I decided to just follow my gut and my intuition and do what I felt was right, which is a very difficult, I think, position for a lot of students, especially Black students, Indigenous students, students of color in the academy. But I think it's also super critical. And I think maintaining that spirit of refusal, I was able to meet the right people and be in spaces with the right mentors who were able to help me find the right ways to articulate that, and sort of navigate that terrain of the academy with maintaining my own ethos. And I think that was really informative and helpful for me. So like my first class with S.A. Smythe, who is an amazing professor, was very instrumental to like my entire graduate degree. It takes one teacher, it takes one mentor, I think, to really change your ideas and inspire you. So I would say that like believing yourself, as cliche as that sounds, is so important. Like maintaining your identity and like believing in your own spirit and like your intuition when something's not sitting right is like so important in the academy.
I think this is an interesting question. I think one that is for me allows for a space to discuss that we all come at this at different times and in different ways, and in some it takes longer than others. I think for me, it took a minute to think about when this started. I had a wonderful mentor, Dr. William Trent at the University of Illinois, who gave me a new directions book from Stage in 2007, speaking around critical quantification. That was during grad school. The funny thing is, I don't think I sat with it as I needed to when he gave it to me. I think I looked at it, read it. Okay, cool. There was a comment from a dissertation committee member during my defense around, what are you going to do with this? As in, how are you going to tell this story around the findings around Black folks in the data? And that right there made me pause, because I didn't want to tell the story around what this was doing, because so many times that same story is told, or in the case of quantification, it's not necessarily told in a way that is beneficial to the community that the data comes from. I think where this all comes together was an opportunity to work with Dr. Sabina Vaught, who was my chair at the University of Oklahoma. Not when I got there, but it took 2 years, but she became my chair, and she brought to my attention the work of Robin D.G. Kelly, Fred Moten, Kay Wayne Yang's book, honestly, in some of her reading groups, and that opened my eyes to what could be in helping me tell the story that I thought I wanted to tell. I knew that I wanted to do something, but I didn't have the language to do so. And fortunately, I had colleagues at the University of Oklahoma who go do it, read it, and they gave me space to read. That's the other thing, is that during my graduate work, in quant methods courses, we read how-to manuals. Honestly, they told us how to do things. They taught us how to use the tools. I can't say that I'd be here if I didn't take those courses, but I didn't have the time, or I didn't take the time to read deeply beyond the work of quant folks. And so it over time, to answer the question, when did I realize it? I don't know, somewhere around 2016, 6 years ago. And it took time to reimagine, rethink, and reread some of the work. So.
We're going to ask one more question, which I feel like you've been answering this whole time. So think of this as anything else you'd like to add to your answer. And that is, and I'll also put this in the chat. So what advice do you have for people who are unsatisfied with approaches to theorizing racism and racialization currently available to them? And keep in mind that the people watching this webinar are, they could be grad students, but for the most part, they'll probably be established researchers across the social sciences. What kinds of courage are needed?
I'm not even sure if it's well, I think it takes a lot of vulnerability, and I think that could be courageous in itself, to be vulnerable enough to say these current ways of theorizing, the ways I've been theorizing, are not the best that I could be doing, or the most valuable to those who I'm researching with or on. And so I think that like being vulnerable enough to admit that and to start that reflection as a researcher is very important. I think it takes a lot of courage, and a lot of people don't do it because it's very hard work and very difficult to look inwards. So I think that is definitely like the biggest piece of advice, is like not to be complicit, and to like have enough courage to be vulnerable with yourself. And I think that also there is so much creativity that goes into theorizing and reading across discipline or becoming undisciplined, but reading so many different people's work, and then coming back and doing that reflection and doing that all simultaneously, I think is really important. And, you know, a lot of people, I think specifically in social work, but also in other areas, we remain very siloed. So you see a lot of social sciences and sciences in particular not reading humanities work, and vice versa. And I think that is actually so necessary for us to read across those texts, because how can you read these deep theories and not be able to apply it to real world situations and vice versa? So I think that all of those things take a lot of time and energy, and that in itself requires a lot of courage and vulnerability.
I appreciated those words. The word vulnerability brought to mind the word humility and the need to be humble with finding your space in a space that you don't know about, and being humble enough to read beyond the bounds of your discipline or your field, beyond the norm, the broad journals, the big journals that come in your field. What's not there? I think what is also needed is finding community in a way that not only supports you, but pushes you to be, this may be cliche, but boundless in the work that you do. I think, Victoria, you hit the nail on the head that the work that I pull from comes from not just education, not just sociology, but Black studies, anthropology, psychology, political science, economics. You know, what would happen if, as in the social science space, if we actually read work beyond these spaces and tried to incorporate and understand what other folks are saying outside the bounds of our existence. And so it does take time, and I think that's one of the hard parts, particularly within the rat race of the academy, right? How do you get published in journals? You publish in journals the way that others have published in journals, by writing towards those journals, and that may not be rewarded to speak outside the box. And so, but yeah, that's it.
This question on how to theorize racism, or what to do when someone is unsatisfied with theories of racism. You know, I find that we often, at least in educational spaces, talk about race, but very, very infrequently, maybe more so now, talk about the issues of racism, you know? And so we, even in classes we'll teach, someone will say, well, you know, the race does this. And I'm like, are you talking about race, or are you talking about racism? And so I wonder if part of being unsatisfied with theories of racism is that we don't really embrace theories of racism, that we try to understand the outcomes of race and how it works, or something like that. And I really have appreciated this conversation, even Derek, you know, mentioning like, you know, I kind of started this along the path and started reading these other things, because if you're trained in a specific tradition to get a dissertation done or to get published in X amount of journal, I mean, part of becoming undisciplined is all of those things, is knowing that the way that, you know, the trajectory of academia at least works is kind of conditioned to get you to it's based off of these. There are field specific. It requires that you do refuse some of the ways in which that works, and hopefully in ways that don't harm your own pathway towards wherever this is that you're going. But it also, I'm like really inspired lately by, you know, Black feminists who just started to craft their own way. You know, I'm going to start doing this way. And a lot of those ideas came from like just being these like huge periods of crises. You know, you think about the 1960s when things are up in revolt and they're like, oh, I can do this. Like, I'm going to study this and then I'm going to do that. And you start to imagine all these new worlds. And so part of it is embracing, I think, like Derek says, is that you embrace all of these other theories that you've never learned and you're probably, or you haven't really engaged, or you're re-engaging with after a long time. And also it means that you have to be really uncomfortable with being a little confused for a while. Like, what? Like, have you ever, after years, just like, my freshman year in college, my professor assigned Sylvia Winter, and I was enthralled. And I was like, couldn't believe it. And I'm like, what do you mean a new human? Like, and this was something that my 18-year-old self was just, you know, completely like mind boggled by. And I went home and I told my mom about that, you know. Well, of course you think that because, you know, you have an idea that was shaped in a little fragment somewhere in Europe, and that idea translated across the world. You can't really fit yourself within that. You need a new poetic. And my mom was like, you know, you're right. And so it's just something about like learning those things at 18. And I hadn't touched that stuff since then. And I taught Sylvia Winter this semester. And I'm like, I can't believe I did that. But it was part of me having to sit back down and trying to see what she's doing, but does very much what Derek says, is pulling from all of these different fields and coming up with a new way to imagine a new form of knowledge. You know, how do you escape the ways which you're kind of fit and confined into this world? And can you create a new way of thinking? And how do you create a new way of thinking if there are journals that require you to do this, or if your field requires you to do this, or you teach in this? And so it is a vulnerability with not knowing, especially if you're supposed to know because you have a PhD. And so now you're all knowing and then you don't really know. So it is like really being uncomfortable with some of these ideas. It is embracing theories across the fields, but also outside of them, like reading literature and all of these things are kind of encapsulated. Like I think about Toni Morrison's work, you know, about all of the ways that Black women weren't this or that, weren't this. And out of all of the things that she wasn't, she created a new space to be herself. And so I wonder, like, how do we envision just not knowing things for ourselves, being kind of comfortable with that, embracing all of these new ideas, reading really broadly, and hopefully having spaces like this that take the ideas seriously, you know, like, oh, we could talk about this with the William T. Grant Foundation. And so that is, to me at least, like a glowing light of ways that these ideas are being embraced, that you can't theorize race and racism and these new approaches to doing work that can be rewarded if only by people who acknowledge and also see what we're doing.
Can I add one more thing? Okay. And Mahasan, you brought up this idea around teaching, and I wanted, maybe this is a specific statement to those who are actually in the space who are teaching, or who have the power granted to them because they're in front of a classroom. Courage requires one to be humble. I'll go back to that in what you know and what you don't know, but also being courageous enough to do something different within the classroom that you have the power to do. Right? There are ways that you can do things differently within the classroom, to think differently, to infuse different authors, to change up a syllabus because you can. Right? The universities have granted you the ability to do that. And I think it is necessary to shake things up, to reimagine what could be. And in doing so, I mean, it's hard because you have to read beyond, again, what it is that you've already been read, but it allows for places of possibility. Reimagining what a quantitative methods course could look like, reimagining what a history of higher education course could look like, or a sociology of education looks like. Who's author, who are you putting in front of students to read? So yeah, that's it.
I think that we can close our conversation. Thank you so much, Derek and Victoria and Mahasan, for your gorgeous contribution to this volume and to this larger Writing Fellows initiative. It has truly been a pleasure to read each iteration of this work and then to be in conversation with you today. And always, my colleague and friend, Kei-Wei Yang, I'm here for whatever conversations we can bring about in the world.
Thank you, Eve, for co-convening, for dragging me out of bed this morning. This was a very uplifting webinar for me today, so I'm just very appreciative.